All right, welcome to day 3 of RailsConf. I'm going to say thank you to Barrett here up front for inviting me to be part of the self-care track. I'm super excited. Thanks to all the organizers. I help organize an event down in Milwaukee, and it's a lot of work. So if you get a chance to thank anyone in a green shirt, please do. My name is Steve. I write it as Steven. People call me Steve. It causes confusion. On Twitter, I'm at @ppopowitz. That's P-E-P-O-P-O-W-I-T-Z. There's a story. It's not that interesting. And email, if you want to get in touch with me, is steven.j.hicks@gmail.com. If anyone is curious, all the slides that we'll go through are available online at stevenhicks.me/getting-unstuck. I am an engineer at a company named Artsy. Artsy is based in New York. And I am not based in New York. I am based in Milwaukee, and I work from my basement, or as I call it, the spider hole. But our mission at Artsy is to expand the art market, and we're really trying to do this by we're providing a platform to collectors for discovering and buying art. I started at Artsy about 6 months ago, and that is when I wrote my first line of Ruby code. I'm new to this community, brand new to this community. On Monday, I tried to write my 5th line of Ruby code, and I ran out of time. But I'm a JavaScript engineer. I've been doing that for, honestly, 20 years at this point. There's some things I've noticed about the Ruby and Rails community already. For starters, you all really love the heart emoji, and I'm cool with that. I can get behind that. The other thing I've noticed is that it seems like there's always 18 different ways to do any one thing in Ruby code, and that's great. I don't know how you all do that without getting into arguments about style, and what I've come to realize is that when you do have discussions about style, you automatically win the argument if you just say idiomatic, like that's idiomatic Ruby. I'm not sure, my research is fuzzy there, like I think there's like a clause in the Treaty of Ghent or something that says anytime 2 parties are at conflict about Ruby code, if one of them says idiomatic, everybody has to drop it and walk away. So I don't know much about Ruby or Rails, but I know stuff about getting unstuck. And one thing I want to start with is to clarify what I mean with the word stuck, because it's really nebulous and it's kind of unclear. Stuck is when you have been working on code and you've been looking at the same code for an hour or for a day or days, and you're frustrated because you can't figure out why it doesn't work. Why doesn't it do the thing that it should be doing, or why is it doing this thing that it shouldn't be doing? And you're getting frustrated, and you're not sure where to go. This is my favorite thing in development, this act of getting unstuck. When someone in a stand-up says, I feel like I'm stuck on this problem and I can't move forward, I get an adrenaline rush, and I think, this is great. I'd love to sit and pair with you and try to get you unstuck. And so over the past few months, I have been just taking notes on the things that I do to help myself get unstuck and the things that my coworkers do to get themselves and me unstuck. And I just wanted to kind of share those notes with you today. The first thing I have to offer you is not so much a strategy as it is a mindset shift. Let's embrace the act of getting stuck. Quick survey in the room. Let's do a show of hands for anyone in here who considers himself a beginner to development. Maybe you call yourself junior, maybe you don't. OK, we've got, it's maybe like a quarter of the people in the room. How about hands for people who consider themselves more mid-level? More of those. And then how about senior level? You've been doing this for a while and you feel like you're pretty good at it. OK. Pretty even breakdown there, probably slightly fewer juniors than the rest, or beginners. Question 2, raise your hand if you feel like you've gotten stuck on code in the last month or so. Hold them up. Hold them up, and I want the juniors to look around this room and notice that everyone's got their hand up right now. So you can put them down. So while you feel like, as a junior engineer, you're going to someday not get stuck on code, I'm really sorry to tell you that that is not the case. It's just going to be different problems that you get stuck on. My coworker, Will, wrote an article that he called "To Start Meditating, Stop Trying to Empty Your Mind." And he writes about, in the practice of meditation, how beginners especially think that they're bad at meditation because they don't have an empty mind. Their mind is constantly racing, and it's constantly filling up with thoughts. Will's point in this article is that that's not what meditation is about. It's not about having an empty mind. Meditation is about recognizing your thoughts, acknowledging them, letting them go, and returning to focus on your breath. He says, it may feel frustrating and like you're doing it wrong, but that is the practice. Similarly, when it comes to getting stuck in your code, it is not a reflection of your skill level or your experience level, as we saw by that tremendous show of hands. It is not an impediment that is preventing you from doing your job. In fact, getting stuck is the job. That is what we're getting paid to do as engineers. It's our unique skill. It's why we get paid to do this instead of somebody else, because we can get stuck on a problem, pound our heads against it, and then get unstuck. And it's okay to be stuck, because that's just you doing your job, which it turns out is to solve problems, not necessarily write code. Writing code is a tool that you can use to solve problems, but that's not what the job is. And it's okay if it takes you a while, because solving problems is difficult and it takes time. With that, I would like to show you some more actionable strategies, and I've broken the rest of the strategies into several groups. The first one is a group that I call Explain the Problem. Explain it to someone else. This starts maybe by writing about the problem. Write down all the things that you can say about your code and the problem that you're having with it. You can do this many places. You can write an email to someone. People still do that. You can write a message in Slack. Everyone does that. Lots of other ways to do it. My favorite on this list is to write a message in Slack to the Slack bot, because the truth is, for all of those, most of the time, before you even finish writing the message and send it, you figure it out on your own. Maybe you are more of a verbal person, and then you can talk to the duck. If you've not heard of talking to the duck, you might also have heard it as rubber ducking. The idea for this is you keep at your desk a small rubber duck. And when you get stuck on your code, you pick up that duck and you start talking to it. And you say, look over here. This is the problem that I'm having. Here's where I think I'm passing this into here. Now, it doesn't have to be a duck. It can be an action figure. It doesn't even really have to be real. You can just pretend it's there. The thing that's probably most important, though, is that you are actually verbalizing your thoughts. Trying to do it in your head is definitely not as effective. Putting it into words helps you out. Maybe instead of a duck, you want to actually talk to a person. This is super scary. But when you get stuck, you can invite a coworker to come look over your shoulder and just say, OK, I'm going to explain this code to you as if they were the duck. Here's all the things that are happening that I think shouldn't be happening, and here's all of this stuff. And this is really helpful to get you unstuck. And maybe you want to take it even to the next level and pair with them. Have them sit down next to you and start, show them the code, but then have them start poking around in it. Hand them the keyboard. Let them play around with stuff, break stuff, and see what they can make happen. Take turns. We pair a good amount at Artsy, not all of the time, but I'd say a good day for me is 3 hours a day. The great thing about pairing, and we'll talk about this more lately, is that it's really good for getting unstuck, but it's even better when you're not stuck. All of these explain strategies work for several reasons, and I think we can start by talking about something called the protege effect. If you've ever taught something to someone, whether that was one-on-one or that was some new team members, or you taught a workshop, If you've ever done this, you've experienced the protege effect. This is where when you teach something to someone, suddenly you understand it better than before you taught it. And there's a couple reasons this happens. For starters, you are inspired to learn the topic thoroughly because you don't want to look like a fool when you're explaining it to these other people. There's also a meta effect to it, where you start thinking about how you would best learn it and how someone else might best learn it. And so you start to reframe it and think about it that way. And that really helps you understand whatever it is that you're explaining. There have been several studies that have been done related to the protege effect. I'm quoting one here. This is a study from 2016. And in this experiment, the control group was told, you're going to learn something that you don't know. And the experiment group was told, you're going to learn something that you don't know, and then you're going to go teach these other people. And what the researchers found was that the students in the learning by preparing to teach intervention developed a more detailed and better organized concept map of the problem. I'm going to zoom in a little bit on that quote and focus on these words. Learning by preparing to teach. The really neat thing about this study and about the protege effect is that those students in the experiment group that were told you're going to learn this and then you're going to teach someone else, they never actually taught anyone else. They were just told that they had to afterwards, and that expectation forced them to choose better learning strategies as they looked at their code, or as they looked at this thing that they were learning. Another thing that happens when we're explaining is that it forces us to challenge our assumptions about the code. This makes me think of some ideas that I have read from a psychologist named Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. If you're not familiar with him, you're likely familiar with his work. In his book in 1997 about creativity, he popularized the concept of flow state. So that state that you get into on a really good day where you start your day and all of a sudden it's the end of the day because you were working on problems that were the exact right level of difficulty for you. But he also is talking generally about creativity, and he says this: experience this one thing for what it is, not what you think it is. This is all about challenging assumptions. And it's similar to what I remember being taught when I was a kid in art class. I had several teachers tell me, draw what you see, not what you think you see. And this, oh my goodness, this makes sense as there's a period in an artist's life where they go from understanding things and drawing things in terms of symbols to drawing things and thinking of them in terms of reality. When you see this drawing, you instantly recognize it as an eye. It's got that eye shape, and it's got a blue iris, and it's got a black pupil. But that's not what an eye looks like. That's just a shortcut. It's a heuristic. It's a symbol of an eye. In reality, an eye looks more like this. It's got a ton of detail. It's got this little red, bloody, pulpy thing in the corner that I'm sure has a name, but I don't know what it is. You can see the reflection of the eyelashes in the eye. And those are definitely blue eyes, but that iris has shades of blue, shades of green, shades of black, gray, and brown. Similarly, when we are focused on a problem in our code, and we think about how our code is really just, we're trying to get these 4 different things to work together. Maybe one of them is some UI, one of them is some business logic, one of them is a database, one of them is some user settings. If you think about this, as you're working through this and you build up this model in your head of how this code works together, each one of those different components turns into symbols in your head. And we just assume that they're working as intended and as we wrote them. We think we wrote them. In reality, if you start to dig in a little bit deeper, what you'll find is incredible detail about each one of those components in your code. Unfortunately, we absolutely have to treat them as black boxes, or we'd be completely overwhelmed with the complexity in our system. We just wouldn't be able to figure out what it does. So we go back. Maybe we focus in detail on one piece of code that we're looking at, but the rest of it, it just becomes a black box. Explaining your code to someone else forces you to look at it more like this. You have to look at all the details in your system. It challenges your assumptions. You no longer can explain the code in terms of, well, this is just the UI, it works fine, don't worry about it. You have to dig into the UI and figure out what it's doing. And that's often when you uncover the issue. Strategy group number 2, I call isolate the problem, and this is all about isolation. This starts with some risk analysis. Ask yourself a few questions about the code you're looking at. What is the thing I've introduced that I know the least about? What is the thing that is most likely for me to improperly use? And what is the thing I'm making the most assumptions about? And if you find that you can confidently answer any one of these questions, there's a good chance that that's where you're getting stuck. Now, whether or not you can answer those questions, we can move on and we can start removing code from our system. This will help us isolate the source of the problem. And there's a couple different ways we can do this. We can delete our code iteratively. Maybe we've got several blocks of code here, and overall, we know that it's not working, but we don't know where. We can go ahead and just wipe out half of it, replace it with a single line that does what it should be doing. And this will help you determine if the issue is in the code you removed or the code that remains. And if it's in the code that remains and you still really can't narrow it down, go ahead and remove more code, delete more of it, and replace it with a single line. This really helps you turn your problem from something like 50 lines of code that you have to look at to 10 lines. We can do something similar if we're using Git or similar source control. If you think of your code as really it's just a series of commits over time, and we're not sure when we introduced this problem, we can start to back out those changes one at a time and then just go reevaluate, look and see if it still happens after we remove that most recent commit. If it still happens, remove the next most recent commit until we get to a point where we have identified this is where we introduced the problem. And again, that helps you make your problem smaller. You're looking at less code to figure out what you did wrong. This is such a great strategy that I recently found out from my coworker John right there, that it's built into Git. There's a git bisect command. I've heard it mentioned at least once at this conference. But if you're unfamiliar with git bisect, what it does is you tell it the last known good commit and the first known bad commit, and it will go ahead and check out for you somewhere in the middle. And then you run a test and say, is it still a problem or does it work? And based on your response, it'll go check out another one in the middle. And it's basically using a binary search to help you identify the single commit that broke your code. If you think of your system of code as this super sweet Lego camper, and something isn't working right in it, the code removal strategies we just talked about are kind of like this. We're like disassembling this finished product, breaking off big chunks to see which one of these chunks doesn't work right. Sometimes, though, we aren't even sure we can build the camper because we aren't sure if the wheel plays nicely with the windshield and if the windshield plays nicely with the raft. And in these cases, it's useful to isolate your problem by building a proof of concept. Demonstrate the problem or the subsystem with just the pieces that you think might not be playing nicely together. So you can identify if it is indeed an issue that the wheel can't play nicely with the windshield. There's a subcategory of being stuck where you can't get started on something. You're stuck in a state of analysis paralysis, and you just aren't sure where to go. And in this situation, my recommendation is to eat the frog. Eating the frog is an expression that comes from Mark Twain, or so the internet tells me, so it might be a lie. He said, eat a live frog first thing in the morning, and nothing worse will happen to you the rest of the day. I can confirm that's absolutely true. But we take that to mean now, basically, do the hardest thing up front. And so if we look back at our system of code where we've got these different pieces that we're trying to get to work together, and we aren't sure where to start. We know we need to end up with this thing somehow that has all these pieces in it, but we don't know what to do. You can take a little bit deeper dive into each of those components. And maybe what it turns out is that 3 of the components that are in there you totally understand, and they're not that complex, and you're not really worried about them. It's that one in the bottom left. Maybe you've never worked with a Mongo database before, and you don't know how you're going to do this thing. In that situation, that's the best place to start. Start with that one that you know the least about, that scares you the most. If it seems like that piece in the bottom left is too big and you still don't know where to get started, just repeat the process. Dig deeper into that section, and maybe you realize there's a couple things that I'm not worried about at all with Mongo. It's just this one particular thing that I really don't know how to do. Starting with that scariest will answer questions for you about how your system is going to fit together. And that is the best place to begin. Writing tests is another way that we can isolate the problem, and tests are, in my opinion, probably the most useful skill as a developer, because they help you tighten that feedback loop so that you can make your changes and observe the results and repeat that. There are a few ways that I have seen automated tests used to help isolate an issue. The first is to write unit tests on existing functions. If you think of your code as a tree of function calls, you can go through them and write unit tests on each one of them. And what you might find is 5 of those 6 different functions up there, or blocks up there, you can make the unit tests pass pretty easily, but that 6th one, you're having a hard time getting unit tests to pass on that one. There's a good chance that that function or that piece of code isn't doing what you think it's doing. Maybe you've got a function that's a little bit larger and scarier to write a unit test for. In this case, what you might find is there are sections in that function that look like they're not that scary, and maybe we can extract them into a separate function and write a unit test of that code. And what this helps us do is identify, again, is the problem in that function that we extracted, or is it in the original function? And integration tests are a neat strategy for finding the source of a problem. What I recommend doing there is start with your entire subtree, whatever the feature is, write an integration test against that feature, and what you'll find is that integration test fails because something's going wrong in your code. But once you've done that, just arbitrarily choose a branch below it and say, OK, well, the whole thing doesn't work, but let's dig one level deeper. And let's write an integration test at that level and see if we can get things to pass there. If we can't get things to pass in that branch, we know we're in the right branch. So let's dig another level deeper. Arbitrarily choose another branch down. And now here what we find is one of those branches, we can get integration tests to pass on that so we understand what it's doing. But one of those branches is still red. And this will help us target and isolate the issue. The common thread for these isolation strategies is break down your problems from large problems to small problems. When a problem has a smaller surface area, it is a lot easier to figure out. Strategy group number 3 is about escape, and this is my favorite strategy to talk about. When you're stuck on a problem, walk away from it. Relax. Go take a nap. Or take a shower. John tells me that naps and showers are a really remote person piece of advice to give people. So maybe you can't do that. But maybe what you can do is just book a conference room and just go turn the lights off and relax for half an hour. When you relax and you shut your brain off from the problem, it wanders. And even though you're not thinking about the problem the full time, it's still processing it in the background. And it can come to the conclusion on its own. We'll talk about the details of that in a little bit. Get some physical exercise. There's so many benefits to physical exercise. It increases the blood flow to your brain. It improves your executive functions. It improves your mood, which is a factor when you're stuck. I know when I've been stuck on a problem, my mood definitely goes south. And if you find a form of exercise that's rhythmic and repetitive, your brain can shut off again and wander and explore it on its own. Find other hobbies. Exercise is a natural one for me because that is my hobby. But maybe you like to play guitar. Or maybe you like to draw. Maybe you like to knit. And if all of those feel like they're just procrastination, move on to a different problem. Set this one aside, go grab a different story from the backlog that's smaller and looks like you can just knock that one out of the park immediately. We don't always get that right, and sometimes we end up now stuck on a different problem. But when we do get it right, it's really helpful because it boosts our ego. It builds up that courage that we need to get back to the original problem. I do this one all the time when I'm rock climbing, and I get stuck on a route rock climbing where I've just done it 6 times, and there's this one spot I can't get past. I'll look around the gym for 2 of the simplest routes I can find, and just go do those. And when I return to that original problem, I feel like I've got this boost that I needed. There's a few things that are happening when we escape the problem. It boosts your confidence, just like I talked about with the rock climbing. If you work on that smaller story, and you're able to get it done really quickly, it's going to remind you that you're doing a great job. Also, when you come back to the original problem, you have to relearn it. You've forgotten that mental model that you had. You've let it fall apart. And now you're rebuilding that mental model. And maybe you'll just do it slightly differently. And this time, you'll understand it better. And your brain, when you're not actively thinking about a problem, can come up with the answer on its own. And there's a few things that happen here. The first is a principle called analogical problem solving. This is when you apply things that you've learned in one activity to things in another activity. So maybe I'm going for a run, and suddenly I realize writing code actually is just like this thing that I did while I was running. And then you start to notice more things, more similarities. Wait, here's another similarity between running and the code that I'm working on. And eventually, you compare these things to each other, and you realize they're a lot like each other, and suddenly you go back to that original problem, the code that you were working on, and you start to think about it in that context of running or whatever that other activity is. And it helps you reframe it, shift it a little bit. There's something called incubation that's also happening when you set a problem aside. Incubation is an idea that was introduced in the 1920s, by a political scientist named Graham Wallas, who wrote about 4 stages of creativity. He said the 4 stages are, number 1, preparation. You're actively thinking about a problem. Number 2, incubation. You set that problem aside, and you just let it sit. And you do nothing, or you do something unrelated to the act of solving that problem. While you're doing that, your brain is still processing it. And then stage 3, illumination, the incubation and the preparation come together, and you have this aha moment. You have this realization, oh, this is what's going on. This is how I solve that problem. And stage 4 is verification. This is vetting the problem and exploring it a little bit further. Now, Graham Wallas was very clear that these aren't sequential. These things don't happen in order. They happen together. And at any one point, you can be in all 4 of them. More recently, Csikszentmihalyi, who we mentioned earlier, he introduced the idea of flow. He also expanded Graham Wallas's stages of creativity. The first 3, he says, are the same, and then he expanded number 4 into 2 things. Evaluation is when you vet the problem and decide if it's a good idea, and then elaboration is when you try to think about more ideas and extend it, push it to its limits. But Mihai does a really great job in his book of describing incubation for us. He says, in incubation, ideas churn around below the threshold of consciousness. It is during this time that unusual connections are likely to be made. When we intend to solve a problem consciously, we process information in a linear, logical fashion. But when ideas call to each other on their own without our leading them down a straight and narrow path, unexpected combinations may come into being. Emphasis is mine on unusual and unexpected. And Mihai really takes this thing straight into the wheelhouse of engineers. He compares it to parallel processing, and he says, when you're actively thinking about a problem, you've got tunnel vision on that problem, and you're pushing it in a linear direction. You're like a problem that can only be processed linearly. When you set it aside, it allows your brain a freedom to pursue this problem in more of a parallel manner. And now your brain can make these interesting connections in ways that you weren't letting it before. Your conscious mind would just have rejected all of these interesting things that it's doing. So often when we're faced with a difficult problem, we think that we really need to focus on it. And if we're not actively focused on this problem, we're procrastinating. But the truth is, when you've got a really complicated problem, your brain and your creativity might need that space to pursue it on their own. Staying actively focused is actually a detriment to those kinds of problems. So give your room some space to explore it on its own. Set the problem aside. Go for a walk. Get a workout in. Take a shower or a nap or book that conference room for half an hour. Read a book about something related or unrelated. Knit. Get in your basement. Do some woodworking. Go for a trail run. Just give your brain the time to expand on this problem and explore it on its own time. All right, group number 4 is all about hardening ourselves for the next time we get stuck. Keep in mind our mindset shift from earlier. Getting stuck is the job. This is what we're paid to do. And go ahead and learn new ways to solve problems. Pair with someone, even when you're not stuck on something. Start a new story together. And what you'll see, what you'll experience, is a whole bunch of new ways to solve problems that you never would have thought of on your own. Go ahead and read code in other projects. See how they're solving problems in their code. Explore new technologies and learn just for the sake of learning. These are all things that are going to help us the next time we get stuck because it's going to give us different strategies. I keep a Trello board that I fill with messages of appreciation and thanks, and I call it my wall of motivation. And it has all these things on it that people have told me I've done a good job at or ways that I've helped them. And I return to it when I'm feeling stuck or when I'm feeling down. And it's really, really helpful. It helps me bring my ego back up. Because when I'm stuck, and I'm guessing a lot of you are the same, I really start to get down on myself. And my self-talk changes for the worse. I start saying awful things about myself, like, why am I still doing this? I should have quit programming years ago. This wall of motivation, when I look back on it, really helps me remember, and it'll help you remember, that you're doing a really, really great job. And sometimes you need to just remind yourself of that. Another of my coworkers recommended when I started at Artsy that I start keeping a journal about all the things that I accomplish every day. And this is really helpful because it reminds you, these aren't necessarily big things that I'm checking off a list, like it's maybe not I submitted a PR or I moved this ticket to done. It's little things like I paired for an hour with John on something. And it reminds me when I look back at that journal, these are all the things I did today. And yeah, I did a good job of getting stuck and getting unstuck. Exercise is super important. It'll help reduce anxiety and depression, amongst other things. And if you're looking for a new form of exercise, I strongly recommend rock climbing. I think it is the best activity for developers because it is all about small, tiny feedback loops. It's all about trying to do one climb that lasts not even a minute. And you fail, and you fail, and you fail, and you learn from it every time. And within 5 minutes, you've failed 7 times, and on the 8th time, you got it. Meditation can be helpful. There's a variety of mental and physical benefits to meditation. Especially in regards to getting stuck, it'll help you level your emotions, which factor in those moments where you are stuck. Your emotions sometimes run amok. And if you can train your body to be a little more in control in those situations, that can be really helpful. And get outside of your head and talk to somebody about the struggles that you have when you're stuck. Do more one-on-ones with your leader, and if that's not somebody you feel comfortable talking to as much, find a coworker that you feel really comfortable talking about all of your struggles with, and maybe they'll tell you all about their struggles, and you'll find out that we all kind of have the same struggles. The common thread for these hardening strategies is to condition yourself. Get in the reps. When you think about a professional athlete, they are faced daily with incredible physical challenges, and they spend a lot of time training their body physically. Professional developers face mental challenges, incredibly difficult mental challenges every single day. So we should do everything that we can to train ourselves to face those problems again. Here is your cheat sheet. Reframe the act of getting stuck. Getting stuck and then unstuck is the job. Let's embrace it. Explain the problem to someone else. This will help you challenge assumptions and rebuild your mental model. Isolate problems by breaking them down from large into small. Let problems incubate. Let your brain process them on its own. Escape the problem and set it aside. And then condition yourself for the next time that you get stuck. Because it is going to happen again, and that's OK. Thanks for your time. Thanks, RailsConf, for having me here, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.